This article is called The Intersectionality Wars by Jane Coaston. There may not be a word in American conservatism more hated right now than intersectionality. On the right, intersectionality is seen as the new caste system, placing non-white, non-heterosexual people on top. To many conservatives, intersectionality means because you're a minority, you get special standards, special treatment in the eyes of some. It promotes solipsism at the personal level and division at the social level. It represents a form of feminism that puts a label on you. It tells you how oppressed you are. It tells you what you're allowed to say, what you're allowed to think. Intersectionality is thus really dangerous, or a conspiracy theory of victimization. This is a highly unusual level of disdain for a word that until several years ago was a legal term in relative obscurity outside academic circles. It was coined in 1989 by Professor Kimberly Crenshaw to describe how race, class, gender, and other individual characteristics intersect with one another and overlap. Intersectionality has, in a sense, gone viral over the past half-decade, resulting in a backlash from the right. In my conversations with right-wing critics of intersectionality, I found that what upsets them isn't the theory itself. Indeed, they largely agree that it accurately describes the way people from different backgrounds encounter the world. The lived experiences and experiences of discrimination of a black woman will be different from those of a white woman or a black man, for example. They object to its implications, uses, and most importantly, its consequences, what some conservatives view as the upending of racial and cultural hierarchies to create a new one. But Crenshaw isn't seeking to build a racial hierarchy with black women at the top. Through her work, she's attempting to demolish racial hierarchies altogether. Meet Kimberly Crenshaw. I met Kimberly Crenshaw in her office at Columbia Law School on Manhattan's Upper West Side on a rainy day in January. Crenshaw, who is a professor at both Columbia and the University of California, Los Angeles, had just returned from an overseas trip to speak at the Sorbonne and the London School of Economics. Crenshaw is a 60-year-old Ohio native who has spent more than 30 years studying civil rights, race, and racism. In her mildly overheated office, the professor was affable and friendly as she answered questions while law students entered her office intermittently as they prepared for a panel discussion coincidentally called Myth-Busting Intersectionality, scheduled for that evening. But it's not just academic panels where the fight over what intersectionality is or isn't plays out. Intersectionality has become a dividing line between the left and the right. Senator Kirsten Gillibrand tweets that the future is female and intersectional. The Daily Wire's Ben Shapiro, meanwhile, posts videos with headlines like, "Is intersectionality the biggest problem in America?" The current debate over intersectionality is really three debates. One based on what academics like Crenshaw actually mean by the term, one based on how activists seeking to eliminate disparities between groups have interpreted the term, and a third on how some conservatives are responding to its use by those activists. Crenshaw has watched all this with no small measure of surprise. This is what happens when an idea travels beyond the context and the content, she said. But those who have worked with her have seen how she can ask tough questions and demand hard answers, particularly on the subject of race, even of her closest allies. Mari Matsuda, a law professor at the University of Hawaii who has worked with Crenshaw on issues relating to race and racism for years, told me she is not one to back away from making people uncomfortable. I also spoke with Kevin Manafu, a former student of Crenshaw's who is now a postdoctoral research scholar at the African American Policy Forum, a think tank co-founded by Crenshaw in 1996 with a focus on eliminating structural inequality. In Crenshaw's civil rights law class, he said, what she did in the course was really imbue a very deep understanding of American society, American legal culture, and American power systems. Manofu described Crenshaw's understanding of intersectionality as not really concerned with shallow questions of identity and representation, but more interested in the deep structural and systemic questions about discrimination and inequality. The origins of intersectionality. To understand what intersectionality is and what it has become, you have to look at Crenshaw's body of work over the past 30 years on race and civil rights. A graduate of Cornell University, Harvard University, and the University of Wisconsin, Crenshaw has focused in much of her research on the concept of critical race theory. As she detailed in an article written for the Baffler in 2017, critical race theory emerged in the 1980s and 90s among a group of legal scholars in response to what seemed to Crenshaw and her colleagues like a false consensus, that discrimination and racism in the law were irrational, and that once the irrational distortions of bias were removed, the underlying legal and socioeconomic order would revert to a neutral, benign state of impersonally apportioned justice. This was, she argued, argued, a delusion, as comforting as it was dangerous. Crenshaw didn't believe racism ceased to exist in 1965 with the passage of the Civil Rights Act, nor that racism was a mere multi-century aberration that, once corrected through legislative action, would no longer impact the law or the people who rely upon it. But there was no rational explanation for the racial wealth gap that existed in 1982 and persists today, or for minority underrepresentation in spaces that were purportedly based on colorblind standards. Rather, as Crenshaw wrote, discrimination remains based on the stubborn endurance of the structures of white dominance. In other words, the American legal and socioeconomic order was largely built on racism. Before the arguments raised by the originators of critical race theory, there wasn't much criticism describing the way structures of law and society could be intrinsically racist, rather than simply distorted by racism while otherwise untainted with its stain. So there weren't many tools for understanding how race worked in those institutions. That brings us to the concept of intersectionality, which emerged from the ideals debated in critical race theory. Crenshaw first publicly laid out her theory of intersectionality in 1989, when she published a paper in the University of Chicago Legal Forum titled Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex. You can read that paper here. The paper centers on 3 legal cases that dealt with the issues of both racial discrimination and sex discrimination. In each case, Crenshaw argued that the court's narrow view of discrimination was a prime example of the conceptual limitations of single-issue analyses regarding how the law considers both racism and sexism. In other words, the law seemed to forget that Black women are both Black and female, and thus subject to discrimination on the basis of both race, gender, and often a combination of the two. For example, D. Graffin Reed versus General Motors was a 1976 case in which 5 Black women sued General Motors for a seniority policy that they argued targeted Black women exclusively. Basically, the company simply did not hire Black women before 1964, meaning that when seniority-based layoffs arrived during an early 1970s recession, all the Black women hired after 1964 were subsequently laid off. A policy like that didn't fall under just gender or just race discrimination, but the court decided that efforts to bind together both racial discrimination and sex discrimination claims, rather than sue on the basis of each separately, would be unworkable. As Crenshaw details, in May 1976, Judge Harris Wangelin ruled against the plaintiffs, writing in part that Black women could not be considered a separate, protected class within the law, or else it would risk opening a Pandora's box of minorities who would demand to be heard in the law. Crenshaw argues in her paper that by treating Black women as purely women or purely Black, the courts, as they did in 1976, have repeatedly ignored specific challenges that face Black women as a group. Intersectionality was a prism to bring to light dynamics within discrimination law that weren't being appreciated by the courts, Crenshaw said. In particular, courts seem to think that race discrimination was what happened to all Black people across gender and sex discrimination was what happened to all women. And if that is your framework, of course, what happens to Black women and other women of color is going to be difficult to see. But then something unexpected happened. Crenshaw's theory went mainstream, arriving in the Oxford English Dictionary in 2015 and gaining widespread attention during the 2017 Women's March, an event whose organizers noted how women's intersecting identities meant that they were impacted by a multitude of social justice and human rights issues. As Crenshaw told me, laughing, the thing that's kind of ironic about intersectionality is that it had to leave town, the world of the law, in order to get famous. She compared the experience of seeing other people talking about intersectionality to an out-of-body experience, telling me sometimes I've read things that say intersectionality, blah, 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 and then I'd wonder, I wonder whose intersectionality that is. And then I'd see me cited, and I was like, I've never written that, I've never said that, that is just not how I think about intersectionality. She added, what was puzzling is that usually with ideas that people take seriously, they actually try to master them, or at least try to read the sources they are citing for the proposition. Often, that doesn't happen with intersectionality, and there are any number of theories as to why that's the case, but what many people have heard or know about intersectionality comes more from what people say than what they've actually encountered themselves. How the right started worrying and learned to fear intersectionality. Beginning in 2015 and escalating ever since, the conservative response to intersectionality has ranged from mild amusement to outright horror. In 2017, writer Andrew Sullivan argued that intersectionality was a religion of sorts. In his view, intersectionality intersectionality posits a classic orthodoxy through which all of human experience is explained, and through which all speech must be filtered. Its version of original sin is the power of some identity groups over others. To overcome this sin, you need first to confess, i.e., check your privilege, and subsequently live your life and order your thoughts in a way that keeps this sin at bay. When you talk to conservatives about the term itself, however, they're more measured. They say the concept of intersectionality, the idea that people experience discrimination differently depending on their overlapping identities, isn't the problem. Because, as David French, a writer for National Review who described intersectionality as the dangerous faith in 2018 told me, the idea is more or less indisputable.